The Xinthian collective had been watching Earth for 3 years before they decided to attack. Their spy drones had mapped every human space station and counted every warship that moved around the solar system. The numbers looked good for an invasion. Earth had only 800 military ships scattered across its planets and moons. The Xinthians controlled 30,000 warships across 12 different star systems. To them, humanity looked like an easy target that would surrender without much of a fight. Admiral Vectesh stood tall on the command bridge of his massive flagship, called the Dominion's Fist. His 4 alien eyes glowed with confidence as he watched 5,000 Xinthian warships drop out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system. Each ship was larger and carried more weapons than anything the humans had ever built. Vectesh knew he was using way more force than needed, but the collective wanted other alien species to see what happened when someone refused to join their empire. Jake Morrison was drinking coffee at his workstation on the Mars orbital tracking station when every alarm in the facility started screaming at once. His mug slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor as the holographic display in front of him filled with thousands of red warning dots. There were so many enemy contacts that they blurred together into one massive red cloud on his screen. Jake grabbed his communication headset and shouted for someone to connect him to Earth Defense Command immediately. His hands were shaking as he tried to count the incoming ships, but the computer kept updating the numbers higher and higher. Karen Webb sat at the communications desk next to him, and her face had gone completely white as she stared at her own screen. Within 10 minutes, every military base from the moon to the asteroid belt went to maximum alert status. General Henry Carter stood in the main situation room, buried deep under the mountains of Colorado, and watched the tactical display with a sinking feeling in his stomach. The numbers were absolutely terrible. 5,000 enemy warships against only 800 human ships, spread thin across the entire solar system. A young officer, named Paul Hayes, turned from his station with fear clear in his voice, and told the general that the aliens were trying to communicate with Earth. Carter was 58 years old with gray hair and scars on his face from fighting in the Mars Rebellion 20 years ago. He had never backed down from any fight in his entire military career, and he was not about to start now. The alien communication came through the speakers and filled the entire command center. Admiral Vectesh's voice was translated by computer into English, and he sounded casual and arrogant as he delivered his message. He told the humans of Earth that they were now property of the Xinthian collective. He said humanity had one day to surrender their entire world and swear loyalty, or the Xinthians would burn every city on the planet to ashes. General Carter's jaw muscles tightened as he listened to the alien ultimatum. He looked around at his staff officers and then ordered someone to send a response message back to the alien fleet. He told them to inform the Xinthians that humanity respectfully declined their very generous offer of slavery. Back at the Mars tracking station, Karen Webb's fingers moved rapidly across her control panel as she monitored the enemy fleet movements. She suddenly called out to Jake that the Xinthians were launching fighter craft, and it looked like they were going to attack the outer colonies first to make an example of them. The first Xinthian attack hit Europa Station, which was home to 30,000 miners and their families. The alien fighters swept through the human defensive ships like they were made of paper. Plasma cannons tore apart the small human frigates that tried to protect the station. Jake watched his display screen in horror as escape pods started ejecting from the dying station. Many of the pods were destroyed by alien fire before they could get to safety. On Earth, President Linda Martinez called an emergency meeting of the Global Defense Council. Leaders from every nation on the planet appeared as holographic images around a circular conference table. Every face looked grim as they reviewed the terrible situation. The premier of the Asian Federation argued loudly that Earth needed to evacuate immediately. He said there was no possible way to win this fight against such overwhelming force. President Martinez snapped back, asking him where exactly he thought humanity could evacuate to when the aliens had them completely surrounded. Every ship that tried to leave the solar system was being destroyed before it could jump to faster-than-light speeds. General Carter stood at the head of the conference table with his hands clasped behind his back in a military posture. He spoke quietly and told them there was one option left that nobody had mentioned yet. He called it Protocol Omega. The entire room went silent when he said those words. Every person at that table knew exactly what Protocol Omega meant. It was the ultimate emergency plan that was created decades ago but was never supposed to actually be used in a real situation. Chancellor Klaus Hoffmann from the European Union asked if Carter really wanted to send out the recall signal. He pointed out that nobody even knew for sure if anyone would respond to it after all these years. General Carter looked him straight in the eye and said with complete certainty that they would respond. The only question was whether they could arrive in time to make any difference. President Martinez took a long, deep breath and made her decision. She gave the order to activate Protocol Omega and send out the recall signal to bring them all home to Earth. The fate of humanity now depended on whether the signal would reach its destinations across the galaxy. High above Earth on the dark side of the moon, there was a secret facility that almost nobody knew existed. Inside that facility, a massive quantum transmitter powered up for the first time in 50 years. The signal it created did not travel through normal space like radio waves. Instead, it punched through the fabric of reality itself and reached across impossible distances instantly. The message was simple and clear: come home. Earth is under attack. Lieutenant Sam Porter was stationed 300 light-years away from Earth when his ship's quantum receiver suddenly went crazy with incoming alerts. He was part of something called the Colonial Expeditionary Force, which consisted of thousands of human vessels spread across hundreds of different star systems. Most people living on Earth did not even know the expeditionary forces existed, because it was the government's biggest secret. Sam ran to find his commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, and told her they were receiving a Protocol Omega signal. Maria Rodriguez went completely rigid in her command chair when she heard those words. She had served in the military for 20 years and never once expected to hear anyone say Protocol Omega in a real situation, instead of a training drill. Sam verified the signal, authentication codes 3 times to make absolutely sure it was genuine. The message was real. Earth was under attack and needed help. Captain Rodriguez's face became hard and determined as she started giving orders. She told her crew to plot the fastest possible course back to Earth at maximum engine burn. Then she ordered communications to send the same message to every other human ship in their fleet group. They were all going home. The same scene played out on thousands of human vessels scattered across the galaxy. Exploration ships turned around in the middle of surveying new planets. Science vessels abandoned their research projects. Colony transport ships changed course away from their destinations. Military cruisers and massive dreadnought warships all received the same emergency recall message. Humanity's secret armada that had been hidden among the stars for decades began turning toward home. Back in the Sol system, the Xinthians continued their brutal attack. 3 more orbital stations were destroyed in the first 24 hours. The human defense fleet fought with desperate courage, but they were hopelessly outnumbered by more than 6-to-1 odds. Admiral Vectesh watched the destruction with deep satisfaction and confidence that the humans would surrender within just a few more hours. What the alien admiral did not know was that Earth's 800 defensive ships were never meant to fight alone. They were just the home guard meant to protect against pirates and small threats. The real military power of humanity had been exploring and expanding across the stars for the past 40 years, building ships and bases in secret. Now all 12,000 of those ships were coming home to Earth, and the Xinthians were about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating humanity. The UES Valiant tore through hyperspace at maximum velocity, with its fusion drives pushed far beyond normal safety limits. Captain Maria Rodriguez stood on the bridge watching a countdown timer that showed 72 hours until they would reach Earth. That was far too long, but there was nothing more they could do to go faster. Maria called down to the engineering section and asked Chief Engineer Danny Walsh how their reactor was holding up under the extreme stress. Danny's voice came back through the speaker, sounding strained as he reported they were running at 115% of rated capacity. He said he could maintain this dangerous speed for maybe 1 more day before the containment systems would start melting from the heat. Maria ordered him to keep them at full burn no matter what. She said Earth did not have a day to spare, and they needed to get home as fast as physically possible. Throughout the entire ship, the crew of 200 people worked frantically at their stations. Down in the weapons bay, Gunnery Sergeant Lisa Patterson supervised the loading of every missile tube on the ship. They had been on a peaceful survey mission when the recall order arrived, so their weapons were fully loaded and ready for combat. The Valiant was not traveling alone through hyperspace. Across 300 light-years of space, humanity's scattered fleet was racing toward Earth like a massive incoming tide. Some ships had been on patrol near the core worlds and were only hours away from home. Other ships would take days to arrive as they burned through their fuel reserves and pushed their engines past every safety rating. Commander Gary Foster commanded a heavy cruiser called the UES Relentless that had been mapping unknown star systems near the edge of the galaxy. His ship was 5 full days away from Earth, and every single hour felt like a lifetime of waiting. Gary stood on his bridge and watched the tactical data streaming in from the Sol system with growing horror in his chest. His communications officer, Lieutenant Amy Crawford, reported that the Xinthians had achieved complete orbital superiority around Earth. They were systematically destroying every defensive satellite and had begun making threats to bombard the planet itself. The human home fleet had been reduced from 800 ships down to only 600, and the number kept dropping. Gary asked his helm officer if there was any possible way to increase their speed even more. The helm officer shook his head and said they could not go faster without literally tearing the ship apart from the stress. Gary slammed his fist down hard on the armrest of his command chair. He told his crew that if the ship needed to be torn apart to save Earth, then they would tear it apart. Closer to home, the first wave of recalled ships began arriving in the Sol system. The UES Defiant dropped out of hyperspace near Jupiter, and Captain Nicole Graves immediately started analyzing the tactical situation. Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Chris Murphy, stared at his display screen and whispered that there must be 4,000 Xinthian ships spread throughout the inner system. Nicole corrected him grimly and said the updated count showed the human home fleet was now down to only 500 vessels remaining. She said they needed to buy time for the main expeditionary force to arrive from deep space. The Defiant was not alone in arriving. 17 other ships had emerged from hyperspace, with her forming a small task force of cruisers and destroyers that had been operating in nearby star systems. Nicole opened a communication channel to all the ships in her group. She told them they were going to hit the enemy supply convoy near Saturn. She ordered a fast strike to cause maximum damage, and then they would scatter in different directions to make the Xinthians chase them across the system. The small human task force accelerated toward the Xinthian logistics ships using stealth systems to hide their approach. The aliens had grown overconfident and sloppy because of their overwhelming numerical superiority. They never detected the human ships sneaking up on them until it was far too late to react. The Defiant's railguns opened fire first, sending tungsten slugs downrange at a significant fraction of light speed. The metal projectiles punched straight through the shields of a Xinthian supply ship and detonated the fuel reserves inside. The ship exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the darkness of space. All the other human ships followed up with their own attacks, tearing into the enemy convoy with precisely aimed weapons fire. Admiral Vektesh received news of the attack with annoyance rather than any real alarm. He muttered that it was just a handful of ships and ordered one squadron to go deal with the problem. But as the hours passed, more and more human ships kept appearing throughout the system. Another 50 dropped out of hyperspace near Neptune. Then 100 more materialized near Uranus. The Xinthian admiral began feeling the first uncomfortable stirrings of doubt. Vektesh demanded to know how many ships these humans actually possessed. His intelligence officer, Sub-Commander Rethak, checked all the data in their computer systems. He reported that their reconnaissance had clearly indicated 800 vessels total for all of humanity. They had already destroyed nearly 400 of the home defense fleet, and the new arrivals numbered approximately 200 ships. So far, Admiral Vektesh concluded that the humans had simply recalled all their patrol fleets from nearby systems. He said it would not be nearly enough to change the outcome of this invasion. He ordered his forces to continue the bombardment of the lunar facilities and military bases. On Earth, General Henry Carter watched the tactical display with cautious hope beginning to grow in his mind. The hit-and-run attacks were actually working better than expected. The newly arrived human ships were refusing to engage in any direct fleet battles. Instead, they kept striking at vulnerable targets like supply convoys and forcing the Xinthians to spread their forces thin, trying to protect everything. Carter asked his chief of staff, Colonel Janet Bishop, how long until the main expeditionary force would arrive at Earth. Janet reported that Current estimates suggested another 48 hours for the majority of the fleet groups to reach the Sol system. She added that even with every single ship recalled, they would still be outnumbered by the Xinthian armada. General Carter said that pure numbers were not everything in warfare. He said the Xinthians thought they were fighting a primitive species with just a handful of system defense boats. He smiled coldly and said the aliens had absolutely no idea what was actually coming for them. Deep in space, the human armada continued its desperate race toward home. The UES Thunderchild was a massive dreadnought that served as flagship for the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet. She led a formation of 300 warships through hyperspace. Admiral Benjamin Cole stood on the command bridge as a veteran of 40 years military service, who had spent the last decade exploring the furthest reaches of known space. Benjamin asked his aide commander, Patricia Stone, how many ships had successfully made it to the Sol system so far. Patricia reported that the latest count showed 450 ships from various scattered fleet groups had arrived. She said they were currently conducting guerrilla warfare operations against the enemy forces. Benjamin nodded his approval of the tactics. He said that when his fleet arrived, they were going to hit the Xinthians with everything they had in one massive coordinated strike. He said there would be no more small harassment attacks. They would engage the entire enemy fleet in direct combat and crush them. The next 24 hours saw a steady buildup of human forces throughout the Sol system. The Xinthians found themselves increasingly frustrated as their ships kept getting picked off in small groups. Supply convoys now required heavy military escorts just to move safely. Bombardment formations had to maintain constant defensive vigilance against sudden human attacks, appearing from unexpected directions. Admiral Vektesh finally acknowledged the uncomfortable reality of what was happening. He asked his intelligence officer how this was possible when their reconnaissance had been so thorough. Sub-Commander Rathak looked up from his computer console with obvious concern on his face. He reported that their latest count showed over 2,000 human vessels now operating in the system, and more ships were arriving every single hour. Vektesh felt a cold sensation of genuine fear for the first time. He said this was completely impossible because their intelligence had been extremely thorough and detailed. There should not be any more ships anywhere. Rathak suggested carefully that perhaps the human intelligence had only shown them exactly what they wanted the Xinthians to see. The truth hit Admiral Vektesh like a physical blow to his body. The humans had deliberately deceived them with false information. The 800 ships defending Earth were never their entire military strength. Those ships were bait in a trap, designed to lure arrogant species into attacking what appeared to be a weak target. Vektesh ordered all forward elements to pull back immediately and consolidate into a defensive formation. He said they needed to establish a strong perimeter and prepare for a major battle, but his order came far too late. The human fleet had been preparing for this exact scenario for decades. Every ship captain knew the contingency plans by heart. Every crew had trained endlessly for the recall scenario. Thousands of human warships were descending on their home system with a single unified purpose, which was to completely annihilate the invaders. General Carter sat in his comedy. The UES Thunderchild emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, with 300 warships flanking her massive armored hull. Admiral Benjamin Cole immediately established a tactical communication network with all the other vessels that had already arrived in the system. This created a unified command structure linking thousands of ships together. Benjamin ordered Commander Patricia Stone to give him a complete status report on all human forces currently in the system. Patricia's fingers moved rapidly across her control console as she compiled the data. She reported that approximately 3,200 vessels were now operational and combat-ready. Another 6,000 ships were still inbound and would arrive within the next 8 hours. The Xinthian fleet had pulled back and consolidated around Earth and Mars with approximately 4,700 vessels in a defensive formation. Benjamin studied the tactical hologram, floating in front of him with his experienced eye picking out weaknesses in the enemy formation. He observed quietly that the Xinthians were scared and said that was good because they should be terrified. He ordered Patricia to signal all fleet commanders that Phase 2 was beginning and they should move into anvil formation. Throughout, the entire Sol system human ships began moving into carefully coordinated positions. The Xinthians had concentrated their forces thinking that defense would protect them. The humans were about to teach them a brutal lesson that in space, Warfare, there was no such thing as a truly defensive position when you were surrounded. Captain Maria Rodriguez brought the Valiant into formation with the 2nd Expeditionary Fleet, which numbered 500 ships under the command of Vice Admiral Kevin Turner. His flagship was called the UES Indomitable, and it was an impressive sight covered in railguns and missile launchers. Kevin opened a channel to all ships in his fleet group and told them their primary objective was the enemy's left flank. He said they were going to punch straight through the Xinthian defensive line and then roll them up from the side with maximum aggression. Maria felt her heart beating faster as she listened to the attack orders. This was the moment that every training drill and combat simulation had prepared them for over the years. She ordered her weapons officer to arm all systems and told her helm officer to prepare for attack speed on her command aboard the Dominions. Fist Admiral Vektesh watched with mounting dread as human ships continued pouring into the system like an unstoppable flood. His tactical officer had stopped updating the enemy ship count after it passed 5,000 vessels because the numbers were simply too overwhelming to process. Vektesh muttered that this was complete madness and asked where all these ships could possibly have come from. Sub-Commander Rathak had finally pieced together the terrible truth. He explained that the humans must have been conducting a secret expansion program for many decades. While the Xinthians watched Earth's home system, the humans were quietly building a massive fleet across hundreds of star systems. These were not defensive ships protecting their home. These were conquerors who just happened to be away when their homeworld was attacked. Admiral Benjamin Cole gave the order that every human commander had been waiting to hear. He said all fleet groups should begin the attack immediately. The human armada surged forward in perfectly coordinated waves like a tsunami of metal and weapons. The Xinthians opened fire first with their plasma cannons, sending deadly beams of energy, lancing through space. Several human ships died in the opening moments, blown apart by the overwhelming firepower. But for every human vessel destroyed, 10 more pressed forward into the attack. The UES Valiant shuddered violently as a plasma bolt glanced off her defensive shields. Maria shouted for all weapons to return fire immediately. The ship's railguns roared, sending depleted uranium slugs downrange at tremendous velocity. A Xinthian destroyer took 3 direct hits in rapid succession, and its hull crumpled like thin paper before exploding. Maria ordered her tactical officer to target the enemy command ship. She said all weapons should focus their fire on that massive dreadnought. Across the entire battlefield, the same scene repeated itself thousands of times. Human ships darted in and out of weapons range, using their superior speed and maneuverability to offset the Xinthians' heavier armor plating. Missiles crossed the darkness by the thousands as point defense systems struggled desperately to intercept them all. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison was still coordinating defensive operations from the Mars tracking station. He watched the battle unfold on his display screens with absolute awe. He called General Carter on Earth and said the general needed to see what was happening. He said the human fleet was systematically tearing the Xinthians apart. In the command center buried deep under Colorado, General Henry Carter allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He said this was the Colonial Expeditionary Force showing what they could do. He said it was the best trained and best equipped military in human history, and the Xinthians had just picked a fight with all of them at the same time. The Xinthian left flank collapsed completely under Admiral Turner's brutal assault. 500 human ships hammered into their formation like a sledgehammer striking an egg. The defensive line shattered as Xinthian ships exploded by the dozens with their shields failing under sustained bombardment. Kevin Turner's voice came over the fleet channel saying the left flank was completely routed and his group was swinging around to attack the enemy center. Commander Patricia Stone reported to Admiral Cole that the left flank breakthrough was complete. Benjamin smiled coldly and ordered Phase 3 to begin. He said all reserve fleets should start their attack runs immediately. The remaining 6,000 human ships that had been holding position at the outer edge of the system suddenly accelerated toward Earth at maximum combat speed. The Xinthians were already badly hurt from the assault on their flank, and now they faced a completely fresh wave of attackers racing toward them. Admiral Vektesh made a desperate decision and ordered all ships to break orbit. He said they needed to withdraw and regroup somewhere safe. But breaking orbit while under heavy fire was far easier to order than to actually accomplish. As Xinthian ships tried to disengage from combat, the human forces pressed their advantage with absolutely no mercy. The UES Defiant had taken heavy damage, but Captain Nicole Graves kept fighting. She led a squadron of destroyers in a suicide run directly at a massive Xinthian carrier. The huge enemy ship tried to turn away, but Nicole had anticipated exactly that maneuver. She ordered all missile tubes to fire full spread immediately. 60 missiles leapt from the Defiant and the other destroyers, followed by concentrated railgun fire that punched through the carrier's weakened shields. The massive ship broke apart in a spectacular cascade of secondary explosions, taking 200 Xinthian fighter craft with it. The battle raged continuously for 6 brutal hours. It was a chaotic melee that sprawled across the entire inner solar system. Earth's orbital defense platforms that had been battered but not destroyed during the invasion now added their firepower to the fight. The massive railgun installations built into the moon opened fire with weapons so powerful they could destroy capital ships with single shots. Gunnery. Sergeant Lisa Patterson aboard the Valiant coordinated the ship's weapons with fierce precision born from years of training. She called out target locks and firing solutions as fast as her crew could load and fire. Another Xinthian cruiser went dark and began tumbling through space as its reactor went critical and exploded. By the 8th hour of continuous combat, the Xinthian fleet was in complete disarray and full retreat. They had lost over 3,000 ships in the battle. Human casualties stood at 800 vessels destroyed, and another 1,000 damaged badly enough to need extensive repairs. It was a terribly costly victory, but it was absolutely decisive. Admiral Vektesh sat on the bridge of his crippled flagship as it drifted powerless through space. Emergency systems barely kept the crew alive as fires burned in multiple sections. He activated the emergency distress beacon with shaking hands and ordered all surviving ships to retreat to hyperspace. Immediately, the surviving Xinthians now numbered fewer than 2,000 ships, and they fled the Soli system in complete disorder. Human vessels pursued them all the way to the edge of the gravity well, where ships could safely jump to faster than light travel. Then the human fleet broke off the pursuit and began regrouping. On Earth, air raid sirens fell silent for the first time in 3 days. In cities all around the world, people emerged cautiously from underground shelters. They looked up at the sky and saw it filled with burning debris from destroyed ships. But above all the wreckage, thousands of human vessels maintained a protective formation with their running lights, creating new constellations in the night. Sky General Henry Carter received a direct communication from Admiral Benjamin Cole. The Admiral reported formally that the Sol system was now secure and the enemy had been completely driven off. Carter asked what the casualty count looked like. Benjamin reported 847 ships destroyed and another 1,000 needing major repairs. Personnel losses were estimated at 93,000 dead. It was a heavy price in blood and ships, but Carter had honestly feared much worse. He asked about Xinthian losses, and Benjamin said they estimated over 2,000. 3 days after the battle ended, the UES Thunderchild hung in Earth orbit surrounded by the assembled might of humanity's fleet. 12,000 ships had answered the recall signal, though nearly 900 were lost in the fighting. The surviving vessels were being repaired and rearmed while their crews prepared for whatever came next. Admiral Benjamin Cole gathered his senior commanders for a war council aboard the Thunderchild. Holographic projections filled the conference room, showing fleet commanders from ships spread across the entire solar system. Captain Maria Rodriguez attended from the Valiant along with Admiral Kevin Turner and Captain Nicole Graves plus dozens of other senior officers. Benjamin began the meeting by saying they had successfully driven the Xinthians from Earth, but that was only the first battle. Intelligence reports indicated the Xinthian collective had a total fleet strength of approximately 25,000 ships. The enemy had attacked with 5,000 vessels and learned a very hard lesson. The question now was what humanity should do next. Vice Admiral Kevin Turner spoke first, saying they should hit the Xinthians before the enemy could regroup. He argued for taking the fight directly to Xinthian territory and showing them the true cost of attacking Earth. Captain Helen Foster, who commanded a ship called the UES Retribution, disagreed immediately. She said revenge was not the same as strategy, and they needed to think about long-term security. She pointed out that if they went on the offensive, they would commit all their forces far from home. She asked what would happen if another alien species decided to attack Earth while the fleet was away. Maria Rodriguez spoke up in a calm but cold voice. She said they needed to make an example of the Xinthians that was so decisive and brutal that no other species would ever dare threaten Earth. She said the aliens needed to understand that attacking Humanity meant complete extinction, but held up his hand for silence and said he had been in constant communication with Earth Defense Command. He reported that President Martinez and the Global Council had authorized a military operation with the codename Hellfire. He said humanity was going to take the war to the Xinthians, but not alone. Benjamin activated a new holographic display that showed a detailed map of nearby space. He explained that over the past several decades, human survey missions had made contact with 47 different alien civilizations. Most were minor powers, but 15 of them had been victims of Xinthian aggression at various times in the past. Intelligence reports suggested that the Xinthian collective ruled through intimidation and overwhelming military force. They had conquered 12 star systems and forced another 30 species into paying tribute. Commander Patricia Stone highlighted several star systems on the map. She said humanity had been reaching out through diplomatic channels to these species. Many of them were willing to join a coalition against the Xinthians because they had suffered under alien oppression for generations. Nicole Graves said thoughtfully that this was more than just defending Earth. She said they were organizing a resistance movement across multiple species. Benjamin confirmed that was exactly correct. He said the Xinthians thought they could bully humanity because Earth appeared weak and isolated. Humanity was going to show them what happened when all the victims united against their oppressor. Over the following week, human diplomatic vessels traveled to dozens of alien worlds. Every species contacted by humanity had suffered in some way because of Xinthian aggression. The Kelthians had lost 2 entire colony worlds to Xinthian conquest. The Moravik Federation paid tribute equal to 30% of their total industrial output, just to avoid destruction. The Prasad Collective had been forced to provide slave labor for Xinthian mining operations in brutal conditions. Commander Gary Foster, whose heavy cruiser, Relentless, had been badly damaged in the battle, now commanded a diplomatic mission to the Kelthian Republic. He stood before their High Council, which consisted of 7 leaders who looked like large cats with intelligent eyes. They regarded Gary with obvious suspicion and doubt. The High Counselor, named Vresha, asked why the Kelthians should trust humanity. She said humans were newcomers to galactic politics who understood nothing. She asked what made Gary think humanity could defeat the Xinthians when her own people had failed. Gary had prepared carefully for this exact question. He said humanity had something the Kelthians lacked, which was desperation and anger. He explained that the Xinthians had attacked Earth directly and threatened human families. He said humans did not see this as some political struggle. They saw it as pure survival, and humans were extremely good at surviving when threatened. Gary displayed video footage from the battle for Earth showing human ships tearing through the Xinthian armada. The Kelthian council members watched in complete silence with their ears pressed flat against their heads in shock. Gary continued speaking and said the Xinthians brought 5,000 ships against Earth. Humanity destroyed 3,000 of them and sent the rest running. Now humanity was bringing 12,000 ships to Xinthian space and inviting every species the Xinthians had ever wronged to join them. He said this was not about conquest or taking territory. This was about making absolutely sure the Xinthians never threatened anyone ever again. High Counselor Vresha spoke quietly with her fellow council members in their own language for several minutes. Then she turned back to Gary and said the Kelthian Republic would contribute 2,000 ships to the coalition. But she said they had conditions that must be met. She said they would not participate in destroying civilian populations. This had to remain a military operation against military targets only. Gary agreed immediately and said humanity was not interested in becoming conquerors. He said they were liberators fighting to free the oppressed. Similar conversations happened on a dozen different worlds over the next 2 weeks. The Moravik Federation contributed 3,000 ships to the growing coalition. The Prasad Collective added 1,500 vessels. Smaller species pledged whatever they could spare, ranging from a few dozen ships to several hundred. Within 2 weeks, the combined coalition fleet numbered over 20,000 ships from 14 different species. Back on Earth, President Linda Martinez addressed the entire planet for the first time since the invasion. She spoke from the rebuilt Global Defense Command Center, and her image was broadcast to every screen on Earth and every human colony across the stars. She said that 2 weeks ago humanity had faced total annihilation. An alien armada arrived demanding surrender. The aliens believed humanity was weak and alone and would not fight back. She said they were wrong about everything. Images from the battle played on screens around the world showing ships exploding and human vessels charging into overwhelming enemy fire. The footage showed the final, desperate retreat of the Xinthian fleet. Linda continued and said that humanity had not only defended their home, but had united dozens of species in a coalition for mutual defense. She said the Xinthian collective had ruled through fear for far too long, and that was ending now. She announced that in 1 week the combined fleet would jump directly to the Xinthian home system. Humanity would demand unconditional surrender, and if the Xinthians refused, then the coalition would dismantle their military capability piece by piece until they could never threaten anyone again. The speech created mixed reactions around the world. Some people celebrated the upcoming offensive, while others worried about the cost in lives. But everyone understood this was a turning point in human history. Humanity was stepping onto the galactic stage not as victims but as a military power, capable of shaping entire civilizations. Admiral Benjamin Cole stood on the Thunderchild's bridge watching the coalition fleet assemble near Jupiter. 20,000 ships from a dozen different species all united for a common cause. It was the largest military force ever gathered in this entire region of the galaxy. Commander Patricia Stone stood beside him and said quietly that it was beautiful in a terrible way. Benjamin replied that war always appeared beautiful until you counted the dead. He said the question was whether they could win without becoming the same kind of monster they were. Fighting Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, who had been reassigned to the Thunderchild as a tactical coordinator, approached with urgent news. He reported they were receiving a transmission from the Xinthian collective requesting negotiations. Benjamin raised his eyebrow in surprise and told Jake to put it through to the main display. The hologram flickered, showing a different Xinthian than Admiral Vectesh. This alien was older with elaborate markings covering his body. He introduced himself as High Admiral Karthus of the Xinthian Collective Defense Force. He said he spoke with full authority of the governing council. Benjamin said he was listening and waited. Karthus claimed smoothly that the attack on Earth had been unauthorized. He said Admiral Vectesh had exceeded his authority without government approval. He offered to provide reparations and guarantee human sovereignty in exchange for peace. Benjamin smiled coldly and said he would give Karthus the benefit of doubt and assume the alien was not stupid enough to think humans would believe such obvious lies. He pointed out that nobody mobilizes 5,000 warships without government authorization. Benjamin made humanity's position absolutely clear. He said the coalition fleet assembled in perfect formation at the designated jump point 30 light-years from the Xinthian home system. 20,000 ships from 14 different species, all coordinated under a unified command structure, created something unprecedented in galactic history. Admiral Benjamin Cole stood on the Thunderchild's bridge, feeling the immense weight of command settle heavily on his shoulders. Commander Patricia Stone reviewed the final tactical plans one last time and announced that all fleet groups reported ready for hyperspace transition. She said the Kelthian forces would jump in on the left flank while the Moravec ships took the right side. The human fleet would form the center of the massive formation, driving straight toward the enemy homeworld. Benjamin studied the holographic battle map displayed in front of him. Intelligence reports indicated the Xinthians had concentrated their remaining military forces around their homeworld called Xinthos Prime. 22,000 ships defended the system, supported by massive orbital fortresses and ground-based weapons platforms capable of hitting targets in space. Benjamin opened a channel to all vessels in the fleet and said this was not a mission of conquest or revenge. He said they were here to end the Xinthian collective's ability to threaten other species permanently. He ordered all ships to minimize civilian casualties and focus exclusively on military targets. He said they needed to show the galaxy that power could be used with honor and restraint. Captain Maria Rodriguez listened to the Admiral's speech from the Valiant's bridge as her crew worked quietly at their stations. They had trained endlessly for combat operations, but the reality of leading an invasion into enemy territory felt completely different from any simulation. Maria gripped the armrests of her command chair as the countdown began. This was humanity's first major offensive action in galactic history. The fleet-wide channel announced ships should stand by for hyperspace transition in 10 seconds. The countdown continued through 9 and 8 and 7. Maria took a deep breath and prepared herself mentally. At 0, the word jump echoed through every ship, and space twisted violently. 20,000 vessels vanished in synchronized flashes of light, crossing 30 light-years instantly. The Coalition fleet emerged at the edge of the Zynthian home system in perfect formation. Alarms began screaming across every ship as Zynthian sensors detected the massive invasion force. On the surface of Zinthos Prime High Admiral Karthus stared at his tactical display in complete shock. The humans had not been bluffing at all. They brought their entire fleet plus ships from species the Zynthians thought were beaten into permanent submission. Karthus ordered all defense forces to battle stations immediately. He commanded the orbital fortresses to deploy and ordered every fighter wing launched. He said grimly that if the Coalition wanted war, they would get complete extinction instead. The Zynthian fleet moved to intercept, forming a defensive wall between the attackers and their precious homeworld. Benjamin Cole had anticipated this defensive strategy. He ordered all ships to execute dispersal pattern Theta. The massive Coalition fleet suddenly split into multiple strike groups, each targeting different sectors of the Zynthian defensive perimeter. The enemy would be forced to divide their forces or risk being outflanked and surrounded. Benjamin assigned the second battle group under Maria Rodriguez to the northern approach vector. He ordered them to hit the Zynthian supply depots and shipyards. The third and fourth groups received orders for the southern approach with instructions to draw enemy attention and force the Zynthians to commit their reserve forces. Maria acknowledged her orders and led 300 ships on a high-speed attack run toward the orbital construction facilities. The Zynthians had built an enormous ring of shipyards in high orbit around their fourth planet. These massive industrial structures could produce new warships at incredible rates. Maria ordered all ships to go weapons-free and told them to cripple the enemy's ability to rebuild their fleet. The Valiant led the charge with railguns hammering into defensive shields surrounding a Zynthian space station. Human and allied vessels poured devastating fire into the construction facilities. A shipyard the size of a small moon suddenly erupted in flames as its fusion reactor went critical. The explosion took a dozen partially built warships with it, creating a spectacular fireball visible across half the solar system. Admiral Kevin Turner led the third battle group in a direct assault against the main Zynthian fleet. His flagship Indomitable was specifically built for this kind of brutal combat, with armor plating thick enough to absorb hits from the heaviest enemy weapons. Turner ordered his ships into battle line formation and said they were going to punch straight through the enemy center and split their fleet in half. The human heavy cruisers formed a wedge with Indomitable at the very tip. They accelerated to maximum attack speed, while weathering tremendous incoming fire from Zynthian defenders. Ships on both sides died by the dozens, but Turner's formation never broke or wavered. Turner roared for all batteries to fire as they reached optimal weapons range. The Indomitable's massive spinal railgun fired with a weapon so powerful it could only be used once every 5 minutes. The tungsten projectile, moving at 10% of light speed, punched completely through a Zynthian dreadnought and crippled the ship directly behind it. Turner shouted that was how it was done and ordered all ships to follow him through the gap his attack created. Benjamin monitored the battle's progress across multiple fronts from the Thunderchild. The Coalition was suffering heavy losses, but the Zynthians were taking much worse casualties. Their numerical advantage was evaporating rapidly under the coordinated multi-front assault. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison reported the Kelthians were requesting fire support because they encountered heavy resistance near the planetary defense grid. Benjamin redirected the 5th battle group to assist the Kelthians and then activated the fleet-wide channel. He ordered all units to commence Phase 2 and shift focus to the orbital fortresses. The Coalition ships changed their primary targets to the massive defense platforms that ringed Zinthos Prime. These fortresses formed the backbone of Zynthian defense, with each one carrying hundreds of weapons protected by shields that could withstand sustained bombardment. Captain Nicole Graves commanded the Defiant, leading a squadron of fast destroyers in a dangerous attack run against the largest fortress. She told her ships they needed to destroy the shield generators before the main fleet could take down the fortress itself. She ordered everyone to follow her approach vector and maintain tight formation. The Defiant and her escorts dove toward the fortress at maximum velocity, dodging and weaving through incoming weapons fire. Point defense systems filled space with defensive laser fire, but the human ships moved too fast and too unpredictably. Nicole ordered all missile tubes to fire simultaneously. 300 missiles launched from the destroyers, overwhelming the fortress defenses completely. The missiles impacted across the fortress surface, seeking out shield generator nodes. One by one, the generators exploded and the massive protective barrier flickered and died. Nicole called to the main fleet that the target was now exposed and vulnerable. A dozen heavy cruisers from the battle line turned their combined firepower on the defenseless fortress. Within minutes, it became a burning wreck tumbling out of orbit. The battle continued for 18 brutal hours of continuous combat. The Xinthians fought with desperate courage, knowing they were fighting for their civilization's very survival. But the coalition had unstoppable momentum, and more importantly, a unified purpose driving them forward. High Admiral Karthus watched his carefully planned defense crumble with growing despair. Half his fleet was already destroyed. The orbital fortresses were falling one after another, and still coalition ships kept pressing the attack. A junior officer reported that the governing council was requesting Karthus' presence immediately. They wanted to discuss terms of surrender. Karthus felt overwhelming bitterness wash over him. After centuries of dominating this region of space, the Xinthian collective was going to fall in less than 1 day of fighting. Benjamin Cole received a priority transmission from the Xinthian government. A council member wearing ornate robes introduced himself as Speaker Vorthus. He said he was authorized to offer unconditional surrender on behalf of the entire Xinthian collective. Benjamin let the words hang in silence for a long moment while his bridge crew held their breath waiting. Benjamin asked what terms the Xinthians were offering. Vorthus said they would disarm their military to level sufficient only for basic system defense. They would immediately release all conquered and tributary species. They would pay reparations to everyone they had wronged. They would submit to occupation and oversight by coalition forces for no less than 50 years. Benjamin glanced at Patricia Stone, who gave a slight nod of approval. The terms were exactly what the coalition had hoped to achieve. Benjamin accepted the terms and ordered the Xinthians to cease all hostile actions immediately. He warned that any ship continuing to fire would be destroyed without mercy. He told Vorthus to transmit the surrender on all channels to every Xinthian military unit. The battle ended as suddenly as it began. Xinthian ships powered down weapons and lowered shields across the entire system. Coalition vessel,